Well, hello dragons, and welcome to this instructional video for Lesson 10 Part 3, Foreign Policy in Action. The main idea behind this civics lesson is the history of the United States illustrates that foreign policy changes over time. With that in mind, by the end of watching this video, you'll be able to explain the major changes in American foreign policy between the American Revolution and World War II, describe American foreign policy during the Cold War, explore world events that brought the Cold War to an end, explain how the rise in new economic powers affects American foreign policy, and summarize the foreign policy challenges that the United States will face in the future. Now that the outcomes for this lesson have been shared with you, let's go ahead and get started. You have learned about the goals of American foreign policy and the tools our leaders use to meet those goals. Although the goals have stayed largely the same over the years, the role that the United States plays in the world is continually changing. At times we have followed isolationism, a foreign policy that seeks to limit our relations with other countries as much as possible. During other periods, the United States has tried to meet its goals by taking an active part in affairs around the world. In its early years, the United States had a mostly isolationist foreign policy. A farming country with very little industry, we had just fought a costly war for independence. President George Washington believed that the young country could not afford to take part in European alliances and wars. He chose a position of neutrality, a policy of not taking sides in wars between other countries. This neutrality served two foreign policy aims. It kept the United States out of war. It also allowed America to continue to trade with both sides in a war. Staying isolated was not easy to do. European countries were expanding into Latin America, competing with our economic interests, and threatening American security. In 1823, President James Monroe responded to the threat with the Monroe Doctrine. He warned European nations not to create more colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Monroe promised that in return, America would stay out of European affairs. Monroe saw this position as a way to protect American interests and still stay isolated from Europe. The policy of isolationism was again tested as Americans began to move west, seeking more land. Expansion forced the United States into contact, and sometimes conflict, with Mexico, France, Spain, Great Britain, and Russia, which each held claims to these lands. The United States used several foreign policy tools to help it grow in size. Sometimes it gained land through purchase or treaty. At other times it used its armed forces to win land in war or by threat of war. Meanwhile, American businesses were expanding across the Pacific, beginning to trade with Japan, China, and other Asian countries. The United States built military bases in Hawaii and the Far East to protect this trade and prevent European countries from setting up colonies. American businesses also expanded into Central and South America. The policy of isolationism did not apply to that part of the world, which the United States, still following the Monroe Doctrine, viewed as being in its own backyard. Many times the United States sent its armed forces into Latin America. Most often the goal was to protect economic interests or national security. World War I forced the United States to change its policy of isolationism toward Europe. Although at first President Woodrow Wilson took a position of neutrality, German aggression caused Congress to declare war in 1917. President Wilson said that the goal in entering the war was to make the world safe for democracy. He believed that this would be the war to end a war, leading to lasting world peace. After the war, Wilson helped found the League of Nations, a new organization intended to help keep peace. However, Congress was eager to withdraw from European affairs and return to isolationism. It refused to approve American membership in the League. The efforts of the League of Nations failed to keep peace, and within 20 years the world was again at war. When World War II began in Europe, the United States tried to stay out of the conflict. However, when the Japanese bombed the American Navy at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in 1941, the United States declared war. When the war ended in 1945, the United States was the richest and most powerful country in the world. It believed it could play a key part in keeping world peace. American leaders met with Soviet and European leaders to make a peace plan. The United States also helped to found the United Nations, an international organization you will learn more about in the next video. The end of World War II marked the end of the belief that the United States should try to stay out of conflicts between other nations. American leaders saw that our own national security went hand in hand with global security. Trouble anywhere in the world could mean trouble for the United States. Therefore, the goal of world peace took center stage in foreign policy. Many Americans thought that the Soviet Union and the spread of communism were the main dangers to the goal of peace. Already, the Soviets had taken control of several Eastern European countries. When the Communists, backed by the Soviets, tried to take over Greece and Turkey, President Harry Truman sent American military aid to help those countries defend themselves. Truman's action was the beginning of a new foreign policy of containment, a policy of using military power and money to prevent the spread of communism. At first, the government's main tool of containment was economic aid. By giving economic aid, the United States hoped to strengthen the economies of European countries so that they could hold out against Soviet aggression. Later, the United States came to depend more and more on military strength and deterrence to support the policy of containment. As you saw, the Cold War was fought with words and warnings, and sometimes confrontation. The Cuban Missile Crisis and the wars in Korea and Vietnam are examples of confrontations that grew out of the effort to contain communism. By the mid-1960s, it was clear the Soviet Union was gaining nuclear strength nearly equal to that of the United States. In the 1970s, the superpowers turned to détente, using treaties and diplomacy to help ease the tensions caused by the military buildup. Through the 1980s, leaders continued to see that depending on military strength alone would not guarantee national security. Even though both the United States and the Soviet Union continued building up arms, the spirit of cooperation grew. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the improving relationship between the superpowers was overshadowed by some breathtaking events. First, communist governments fell in Poland and other Eastern European countries. Then the Soviet Union itself began to fall apart. Suddenly, the ground on which 45 years of American foreign policy had been built had shifted greatly. No longer could Americans picture the world as a Cold War battleground, with communist nations united against democracies. Changes had begun to take place in the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s. Mikhail Gorbachev, the new head of the Soviet Communist Party, undertook reforms known as perestroika, aimed at improving the economy. Perestroika loosened some government controls over the economy and encouraged some private business. Gorbachev also announced a policy of glasnost, or openness, between government and citizens. Gorbachev's policies gave the people of the Soviet Union a taste of freedom, and they wanted more. Citizens grew impatient with the slow pace of change, and nationalist feelings erupted among the diverse peoples of the 15 Soviet republics. By the end of 1991, every Soviet republic had declared its independence, and the communist central government had been dissolved. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. As an independent nation, Russia began making the transition from communism to democracy and a market economy. In June 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected president in Russia's first popular election. Relations between Russia and the United States continued to improve. In 1993, President George H.W. Bush and Yeltsin signed a major nuclear arms reduction treaty. Throughout the 1990s, however, Russia's economy remained stuck in a deep recession. Reflecting the new spirit of cooperation between Russia and the United States began helping its longtime rival. Along with other nations, the United States gave Russia billions of dollars of financial aid. As the Soviet Union began to collapse, dramatic changes took place in Eastern Europe as well. In 1989, Hungary declared itself an independent republic. Voters in Poland elected the first non-communist government in the region since World War II. In Czechoslovakia, after masses of citizens marched in the streets, communist leaders gave up power. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall, a symbol of the Cold War, was torn down by the people of Germany. The United States began helping the nations of Eastern Europe establish democratic governments and market economies. As with Russia, the United States developed friendly relations with its former enemies. In 1999, 3 former communist nations, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, were invited to join NATO. As you have seen, the end of the Cold War caused dramatic changes in American foreign policy. The United States was left as the world's only superpower. How should the United States use this power to promote peace and economic growth around the world? This question will continue to challenge American policymakers in the 21st century. Some observers of the startling events in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union spoke of the death of communism. However, the world's most populous country, China, was still ruled by a communist government. Trade has increased between China and the United States, but China's treatment of its own citizens has hurt relations between the two countries. Americans were outraged when Chinese troops crushed a student-led democratic movement in 1989, killing hundreds of protesters in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. There has been debate over how to react to these human rights violations. Should we punish China by cutting off diplomatic relations and trade? Or should we maintain such contacts as a way of influencing Chinese leaders? During, and primarily after the Cold War, Islamic extremists, angered by American involvement in Middle Eastern affairs during the Cold War, have carried out attacks against the United States since the late 1970s. For example, in 1983, military barracks housing American soldiers in Beirut, Lebanon, were attacked by a car bomb. In 1988, a bomb aboard Pan Am Flight 103 detonated over Lockerbie, Scotland. In 1993, a truck bomb exploded in an underground garage in New York City's World Trade Center. In 2000, the USS Cole was attacked in the port of Aden, Yemen, while refueling. And, of course, more than 3,000 Americans died during attacks on the World Trade Center in Washington, D.C. on September 11, 2001. Following each of these attacks, the United States has responded in multiple ways. Following the barracks bombing, the United States withdrew troops from its peacekeeping mission in the Lebanese Civil War. The United States imposed sanctions on Libya for providing a safe haven for the terrorist suspects of the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing. The United States targeted leaders of Al-Qaeda, an international terrorism network, for its role in the attack on the USS Cole and both World Trade Center attacks. And the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, overthrowing governments that were unfriendly to American foreign policy. The United States emerged from the Cold War as the world's strongest economic and military power. The threat from another superpower no longer exists. Now the United States can rethink how it deals with the world. Some Americans think the United States and its Western European allies should help the former communist countries of Eastern Europe to strengthen their democracies and help develop their economies. Others say we should concentrate on our own domestic problems. Most Americans believe, however, that isolation is not a workable foreign policy in an interdependent world. Neither is relying on economic or military power. Foreign policy decisions are likely to be more difficult now that the enemy is no longer easy to identify. Each problem will have to be handled case by case, but at least the end of the superpower conflict has removed a major barrier to cooperation. The United States can begin to establish a new role. So that's the way it is with Lesson 10, Part 3, Foreign Policy in Action. At this point, you should know that America's foreign policy goals has changed since the presidencies of George Washington and James Monroe, and through each era in American foreign policy, the United States has had to deal with a changing world. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to have the entire catalog of civics videos available at your fingertips. Click the subscribe button and then click the follow bell to receive notifications as to when the channel is updated. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in class, Dragons.